evil. It has as many faces as there is people on Earth, because there's no right idea of what's evil and what's just. What some people believe is the physical embodiment of justice, others believe is the face of true evil. And that's because the human experience is incredibly subjective. We're all raised with different circumstances, we're all born with different genes, and therefore something that we believe concretely, somebody could oppose concretely very easily. And while this absolutely applies to the real world, it also applies to the fiction that we consume. While most believe that Nagato's intentions of making the entire world feel pain so nobody would ever hurt each other again was the wrong thing to do, there are absolutely people who sympathize with his cause. While most believe that Madara casting the world into infinite Tsukiyomi so that they could have their perfect dream of a life was the wrong thing to do, there's many people who believed that that would be nice, in premise. Because obviously we learned down the line that Infinite Tsukiyomi was just deployed to create more White Zetsus so Kage could use them in a battle against the Otsutsuki. It's more the idea of an infinite dream where you get whatever you want that some people sympathized with. While these characters, Madara and Nagato and many other bad guys all throughout Naruto, bring up legitimate moral questions that have split sides, there is one character that very few people sympathize with. See, while Madara and Nagato definitely have their fans, today we're gonna talk about my favorite bad guy. That bad guy being Danzo. See, while I love a villain who has a tragic backstory that turned them into an idealistic terrorist trying their best to reshape the world in probably the incorrect way more than that, I love somebody who's just evil. And Danzo is most definitely just evil. See, while there's people out there who would make the argument that Danzo was always doing what he thought was best for Konoha, what he was doing was almost 100% of the time not what was best for Konoha. And the quite literal best example of that is when Danzo wanted to destabilize the Hidden Rain and ended up creating the Akatsuki. See, Danzo was a complicated man, a man responsible for the hidden operations of Konoha. He was the leader of the Root, the third Hokage's head advisor. And more than anything, he was a man who would stop at nothing to make sure that Konoha came out on top. But one of his biggest blunders happened at the conclusion of the Third Great Shinobi World War, when Danzo saw strengthening Akatsuki movement lighting the fires of change in the Hidden Rain. Danzo, afraid that the Akatsuki would link up with the Hidden Rain, who had just previously defeated Konoha in a war in the Second Great Shinobi World War, decided he would have Hanzo, the salamander, cannibalize the Akatsuki by turning them against each other. And he accomplished all of this by simply laying 3 dead bodies at the foot of Hanzo the salamander and saying, Look what Nagato did. And just like that, that's all Hanzo the salamander needed to decide the Akatsuki had to go. But this has always been suspect. Hanzo the Salamander is known as one of the most powerful and disciplined ninjas in existence. A man who fought against and defeated the legendary Sannin, Mifune, and Granny Chiyo. A legend of the Second Great and Third Great Shinobi World War era of ninjas. A man with arguably no rival outside of maybe Sakamoto Hatake. And yet, under the weight of the slightest provocation from Danzo, Hanzo decided to throw his convictions out the window and no longer agree with the ideologies of the Akatsuki. And in that moment, going so far as deciding to kill Yahiko to cut the head of the snake off. But why would Hanzo throw all of his convictions and, more importantly, his power out the window? As not only did Hanzo the Salamander lose all of his convictions that allowed him to agree with the Akatsuki, he also got way weaker. Now, the narrative that we've been given in Naruto is that Hanzo, after the conclusion of the Second Great Shinobi World War, became obsessed with power. And in his battle against Mifune, we learned that Hanzo no longer honed the sword that was his body, becoming so self-centered that he forgot to battle against each other and push himself constantly. And because of this, he lost all of the power that he was so desperate to hold on to. But based off the pretty good amount of information we have about Hanzo the Salamander, this narrative doesn't line up all that well. So the purpose of today's video is to ask the question, what if Hanzo didn't lose his convictions, but was instead cast into Genjutsu and was acting merely as a puppet of Danzo? Yes, that's right. Today we're asking the question, was Hanzo the Salamander under Kodowa Matsukame? But before we get to speculating about Hanzo the Salamander's mental health, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if there's any other anime out there you like besides Naruto and Boruto, I'd probably talk about them on my other anime channel, The Weeb Commander, where I talk about all other anime besides Naruto and Boruto. And if you like the idea of me talking about all the anime out there, you're gonna love my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime. This week, it's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, the Hidden Rain. They've always been a point of contention for Konoha. The animosity between the Hidden Rain and the Hidden Leaf started in the Second Great Shinobi World War. When the Hidden Stone, the Hidden Sand, and the Hidden Leaf all wanted to battle against each other, they all met in the middle of all of their countries, which was unfortunately the Hidden Rain. However, the Hidden Rain didn't love being used as a battlefield, so a prodigal figure in the Hidden Rain, a child who was an experiment to essentially create the perfect weapon, who had grown up to very much become the perfect weapon, Hanzo the Salamander, stepped up and battled back 3 separate nations, defeating the likes of Granite Chio from the Hidden Sand in her peak, defeating the legendary Sannin, and beating back the Hidden Stone, one of the fiercest military forces on Earth. And in that moment, the Hidden Rain was put on the map, a small country with the military might to go toe-to-toe with anybody. And while a large part of the Hidden Rain was destroyed in this conflict, the Hidden Rain won, in that all the other countries had to retreat out of the Hidden Rain. Winning is subjective. But Hanzo the Salamander's rocket ride to stardom and power wasn't the only thing that came out of the Second Great Shinobi World War, as on top of Hanzo cementing himself as the true leader of the Hidden Rain, the Akatsuki was also technically formed because of the Second Great Shinobi World War. Jiraiya stumbled upon the Ame orphans and trained them up, and then they went on to start the first iteration of the Akatsuki, which started as a group of trained individuals trying to use dialogue to find peace between nations. And well, yes, technically the Akatsuki was taking on ninja work while trying to get this dialogue whole thing going, and therefore they were openly engaged in conflicts. The only reason they were taking that ninja work was for money, so that they could have enough power to push this dialogue idea onto everybody. And the Akatsuki were a rapidly growing force, with real-life political pull on the level of some small countries. I mean, they had a wielder of a dual Rinnegan on their side. Any ninja work they needed to accomplish, Yahiko, Nagato, and Konan sorted out pretty quickly. And for a long time, the Akatsuki and the Hidden Rain government coexist. In fact, they more than coexisted. They respected each other, and they wanted each other's ideologies to spread around the world. At least we know for a fact that that's what Hanzo believed. See, Hanzo the Salamander, for his entire life, had been obsessed with the idea of a free, safe, and powerful Hidden Rain. And in a sense, he was created to bring that reality to life. The Hanzo as a child had the poison sac of a river salamander implanted into his body that allowed him to create the poison of the black salamander, an insanely strong poison that could wipe out entire battlefields of enemies. But more than just being a child experiment, Hanzo dedicated his entire life to constantly getting stronger. In his flashback battle against Mifune, we see that he's a man dedicated to fighting the strongest people he possibly can in order to make himself stronger for the Hidden Rain. In fact, he respects Mifune so much for not retreating and covering the retreat of his fellow samurai that he gives him the antidote to his poison. And Hanzo has a track record of doing things like this. Hanzo shows pity on those he fights so long as they have promise. This is why he not only named the legendary Sannin, but let them go back to Konoha, because one day he wanted to fight them again, and he wanted to be the strongest version of himself in order to battle against them. And for a long time, he was the strongest version of himself. In the Second Great Shinobi World War, he was probably the strongest human on Earth. But by the time the Third Great Shinobi World War comes around, for some reason, he's a frail, decrepit man desperate to hold on to his power, who couldn't even take out one of the paths of pain. How do we get from a man who was able to defeat a man who was able to defeat 4 paths of pain while also battling against Orochimaru and Tsunade, to a man who stared down death in complete fear without the ability to defeat even one of the paths of pain? Now, like I said earlier, the narrative we have on this is because he became obsessed with power and stopped working on himself. He no longer trained or battled and focused on keeping as much power in the Hidden Rain to himself as possible. But why? Why have this shift in personality? Is it to teach us the story that absolute power corrupts absolutely? Probably. But ignore narrative plot devices here and have a little fun heading down the, well, this might have happened trail with me. See, instead of the possibility of Hanzo gaining a position of power and that position of power going to his head, what if instead Danzo identified that the selfless and defensive nature of Hanzo as the ruler of the Hidden Rain would create them into one of the world's greatest military mights? A military might that would one day rear its ugly head back at Konoha and possibly work together with the likes of the Hidden Stone or the Hidden Sand to finally crush Konoha for good. Well, we actually know that Danzo feels exactly that way. See, the reason that Danzo cooked up the scheme to turn the Akatsuki versus the Hidden Rain is because he realized that if the Akatsuki and the Hidden Rain gained power in the Hidden Rain, they would pose a legitimate threat to Konoha. And the chance of these two parties linking up was high. Danzo watched the Akatsuki in their formation. He watched them go across the nation and try to find peace through dialogue. In fact, he respected what they were doing so much that he hoped that they succeeded and their ideology would spread across the world. And Hanzo wanted to talk with the likes of Yahiko and Nagato and Konan and work together with them to spread this way of thought, which is why the idea of Hanzo becoming this power-hungry monster who's trying to grab everything he can and keep it away from everybody else makes no sense to me. Think about the timeline. The third data book tells us that the Second Great Shinobi World War and the Third Great Shinobi World War were basically back to back, with the exact wording being that the Second Great Shinobi World War rolled into the Third Great Shinobi World War. So at the end of the Second Great Shinobi World War, we have Hanzo defeating the legendary Sannin and turning Konoha back. So at that moment, Hanzo has both his convictions and his power. Now, the event with Danzo coming into the Hidden Rain to try and turn the Akatsuki versus the Hidden Rain is at the end of the Third Great Shinobi World War, which is spitballed to have lasted anywhere between 7 and 10 years. Now, I know that's a good amount of time, but stick with me here. We know that after the conclusion of the Third Great Shinobi World War, the Jiraiya stayed in Ame for 3 years, training the Ame orphans. We know that when Jiraiya returns to the village, that Minato is already a Jonin, with genin of his own, and conservative and accurate estimations would place Minato anywhere between 14 and 16 at this time. And since we know that Minato was the Hokage for 2 to 3 years, and he became the Hokage after the conclusion of the Third Great Shinobi World War, that means that Jiraiya returning to the village when Minato is about 15 years old and Minato becoming the Hokage at roughly 21 gives us about 6 years of the Akatsuki existing prior to the Yahiko Nagato stabbing. And well, obviously, it probably took a while for the Akatsuki to grow their numbers, and we know they grew their numbers. If we take the story at face value here, that means in those 6 years, somehow Hanzo went from a man who respected the Akatsuki and wanted their power to grow to the point where their ideologies were a worldwide accepted way of dealing with problems to a bitter, frail old man who was trying to do everything he could to grasp any last bit of power he could. But those two ideologies don't line up intrinsically. How could Hanzo, somebody apparently very worried about retaining as much power in the Hidden Rain as possible, want another entity in the Hidden Rain to become a worldwide force, even going so far as wanting to work with this entity that also existed in the Hidden Rain to spread their influence? The very idea of the Akatsuki from the jump threatened Hanzo's grip of control and power in the Hidden Rain. However, because he was a man of his ideals, he was willing to threaten his power in order to achieve peace. And up until he met Danzo, and Danzo laid the corpses of a couple of Hidden Stone shinobi at his feet. They were shinobi who used the transformation technique to look like Hidden Stone shinobi, and then they attacked the Akatsuki, and then Danzo collected their bodies and laid them in front of Hanzo. It was at that moment that Hanzo decided,
the Akatsuki have gone too far. I can no longer respect them. I don't want them to be a worldwide force.
Why wouldn't he talk to Yahiko or Nagato? Why would he jump straight to, let's kill the leader of the Akatsuki? Genuinely, the shift in attitude, given the timeline that we understand, feels too severe, especially when considering the supposed crime of the Akatsuki. I mean, literally all Danzo does is have a couple of Anbu/Root members use transformation jutsu to turn themselves into Hidden Stone shinobi, and it has them create a ruckus on the outskirts of the Hidden Rain that the Ame orphans go to subdue through dialogue. However, when these Anbu members attack Nagato, Nagato kills them. It's not like Nagato wipes out an entire platoon. It's not like Nagato burns down a city. He kills a couple of Hidden Stone shinobi who are attacking the Hidden Rain, and yet somehow that's enough to convince Hanzo, who for years has sympathized with the Akatsuki cause, to kill the leader? And while obviously we understand that Danzo was the motivating force in all of this, understanding why Danzo was the motivating force in all of this helps understand this theory just a little bit better. See, the reason that Danzo wanted the Akatsuki and the Hidden Rain to not come together is because he believed that they would work together with the Hidden Stone. On top of this, by sowing discord in the Hidden Rain, he believed that it would extend the Third Great Shinobi World War. Because as we know, Hiruzen decided to step down as the Hokage in order to bring all of the blame of the Third Great Shinobi World War onto himself. However, Danzo believed that Konoha had the rest of the world by the throat, and therefore calling an end to the Third Great Shinobi World War was actually Konoha letting go of its advantage. Therefore, by sowing discord in the Hidden Rain, a very powerful and turbulent area, Danzo believed the Third Great Shinobi World War would be continued. For all intents and purposes, this was one of the most important things that Danzo had ever done, at least to him. I mean, if Danzo was successful in making sure the Hidden Rain remained at war with all other places, Konoha could take over the world. Now, the reason it's important to understand that is because we need to understand that Danzo was pretty desperate. Desperate enough to try anything. Now, just having a couple of Anbu members dress up as Hidden Stone Shinobi in order to sow discord isn't really trying anything. It also shouldn't be enough to convince Hanzo. However, we do know that Danzo, when he was meeting with Hanzo, had a bandage on his face. And if Danzo had a bandage on his face, that means this was after he had killed Shisui. Which makes sense because he killed Shisui while Hiruzen was Hokage. Wait. No. If Danzo was trying to extend the Third Great Shinobi World War, that means that Minato hadn't even become Hokage yet. If Minato hadn't become Hokage yet, that means that Naruto wasn't born yet, which means that Itachi was like 2. The conflict that killed Yahiko definitely happened in the Third Great Shinobi World War. Why was he wearing a bandage? So there's no way that he could have had Kodoa Matsukame. Shisui doesn't die until long after the conclusion of the Third Great Shinobi World War, years even, because we know that Shisui awoke his MS in the Third Great Shinobi World War when he was young, and we know that Itachi saw a battlefield for the Third Great Shinobi World War, but he was also very young. There's like at least a decade there. So it can't be Kodoa Matsukame. At least it can't be Shisui's Kodoa Matsukame, which actually strengthens this theory. Okay, none of this was planned. But we're about 13 minutes into the video here, and I just found a fatal error to this theory that somehow I didn't think of previously. Yes, the Kodoa Matsukame in Danzo's face cannot be Shisui's. Well, at this point, Shisui has unlocked Kodoa Matsukame. Danzo hasn't stolen it yet. However, Shisui isn't the only person ever with Kodoa Matsukame. In fact, multiple people have been said to have genjutsu similar to Kodoa Matsukame. Those two people being Obito and Shisui's grandfather, Kagami Uchiha. See, Shisui states that Kagami Uchiha had genjutsu stronger than his own, which is terrifying when you consider the fact that Shisui had Kodoa Matsukame. However, the weird thing about Kagami Uchiha is that even though we see him acting as Tobirama's guard when Tobirama is retreating from the Hidden Cloud in the First Great Shinobi World War, that is genuinely the only time we ever see Kagami, with it largely being believed that Kagami Uchiha is dead by the time that Shisui and Itachi are toddling around, at least by the time that Shisui and Itachi meet each other. Now, as to where we lost Kagami Uchiha, we'll never know. We know he was alive during the First Great Shinobi World War. We know that him and Danzo were close, and that's pretty much it. The reason that we know both him and Danzo were close is because both him and Danzo were on Tobirama's protection detail. Now, there are a lot of places that Kagami Uchiha could have died. He could have died in the First Great Shinobi World War. He could have died in the Second or the Third. But considering that Kagami Uchiha's age is relative to Danzo, he probably survived through the First Great Shinobi World War, as he at least needed to have kids. Now, unfortunately for us, we don't have any images of Danzo between the First Great Shinobi World War and where we see him in the Hidden Rain in the Third. The Second Great Shinobi World War is one of the least understood eras of Naruto ever. So when exactly Danzo acquires this bandage, we don't really know. However, what we do know is that Orochimaru doesn't flee the Hidden Leaf until after the conclusion of the Third Great Shinobi World War, which means that Orochimaru and Danzo haven't worked together to give him Shin Uchiha's arm yet. As we know, Danzo sought out Orochimaru after he was expelled out of the village, and that's when he got Shin Uchiha's arm, even though he was most likely working in conjunction with Orochimaru in order to try to recreate wood release, which means Danzo, like any other user of a dojutsu that doesn't come from their clan, could only use one, because obviously you can't deactivate it, so you need to be able to cover one. And thus Danzo actually had Kodoa Matsukame before he even had Shisui's. I mean, think about it. It actually makes a fair amount of sense. When Shisui laid out his plan to use Kodoa Matsukame on Fugaku to brainwash him into stopping the coup, Danzo stated that Shisui's eyes would be better suited if they were in his hands. Now, while this sounds like just something an evil dude would say, what if Danzo was kind of tipping his hand here? What if Danzo thinks the Kodoa Matsukame would be better suited in his hands because he's used it before. See, there's revolving theories about Shisui's Kodo Matsukame. Since every single Uchiha outside of Shisui apparently has different abilities in each eye, people have begun to speculate that Shisui also had 2 different abilities in each eye, with them both being Kodo Matsukame, but Kodo Matsukames of different severity. With the eye that Itachi and Shisui held on to having the Kodo Matsukame that's able to completely brainwash anybody and has a 10-year cooldown because the brainwashing is so complete that you can never be broken out of it, with the other eye having a lesser, more minor brainwashing that does completely change who you are, but you can be broken out of it. And that's the eye that Danzo ended up with. And the reason that Danzo is able to use this Kodo Matsukame so frequently isn't only just because he has Hashirama's cells, but also because he has the weaker version of Kodo Matsukame that has a lesser cooldown. But if Kagami Uchiha's ocular prowess is said to be greater than that of Shisui, maybe both of his eyes had a higher level of Kodo Matsukame, one that you can't be broken out of, but also has a very long cooldown. And mind you, since at this current moment, Danzo does not have Hashirama's cells, he wouldn't have the insane healing factor that allows him to recover Kodo Matsukame quicker. So, if hypothetically Danzo, who was most likely serving somewhat beside Kagami Uchiha for decades, happened to either be the reason that Kagami died or be around when Kagami died, decided to not let his eyeballs go to waste and pluck one out and place it in his face, he would be the wielder of a genjutsu similar to that of Kodo Matsukame. However, he would also have the insane cooldown that comes along with that. And thus, when Danzo met with Hanzo, he wasn't simply just laying bodies out in front of him to show him how far the Akatsuki had strayed. He was also doing something very similar to what he did to Mifune at the 5 Kage Summit. He was, under the guise of a conversation, without having to remove his bandage, placing somebody very important under genjutsu. A genjutsu so complete that Hanzo completely abandoned his ideals. He threw out the notion that the Akatsuki were the good guys, instead taking the word of a ninja from a village that had destroyed his village just a couple of years prior. And just like that, Hanzo wanted the Akatsuki gone. But stick with that. Remember that Hanzo had his ideologies in line until Danzo told him elsewise. Meaning that at this current moment, for all intents and purposes, there's no reason for us to believe that Hanzo had stopped sharpening the blade that was him. Hanzo at this moment seems as powerful and regal as he ever was. Because not only does Hanzo see a change in ideology, he also sees a change in power. How would genjutsu make Hanzo weaker? Well, there's a precedent for that. See, the other person outside of Kagami and Shisui that holds a genjutsu similar to Kodo Matsukame is Obito. And we know that Obito used this genjutsu on Yagura, the 4th Mizukage. Now, Obito used this genjutsu on Yagura to trump up his bloodlust, to create the Blood Mist Village, to keep it under the control of Obito, and also exact revenge for Rin's death. However, Yagura didn't stay under this genjutsu forever. I mean, he did stay under it for years, but not forever. When Ao, the Hyuga killer, acquired a Byakugan and looked at Yagura, he saw that Yagura's chakra was disturbed, and thus broke Yagura out of this genjutsu. However, breaking him out of this genjutsu wasn't for the best. See, the problem of being placed under a powerful genjutsu is that for years, your 5 senses are completely changed. They are controlled, manipulated, and completely destroyed by the person who put you under that genjutsu. Therefore, being broken out of that genjutsu is an intense shock, and that intense shock basically killed Yagura. It made him catatonic until eventually he died. So what happened to Hanzo? Well, my theory speculates that Hanzo was placed under this genjutsu that made him a power-hungry fiend who was only concerned with making sure he could hold onto as much money and power as he could. And once he was placed under this genjutsu, Hanzo stopped training. The blade that was him became dull. He became more focused on uprooting other powerful entities in his village than making sure that he was the most powerful entity. See, because the way that Hanzo had held onto his power previously was simply by being the strongest dude. But the ideology switch between wanting people around you to be powerful so you can power up by fighting them to killing anybody else who was powerful because they threaten your power happened because of genjutsu. So as Hanzo switched to this different kind of ideology, he became weaker. But what if the real reason that Kagami Uchiha's genjutsu was so much stronger than Shisui's wasn't because the brainwashing is more complete or you're unable to break them out of Kodo Matsukame, but instead that being placed under this genjutsu weakens you substantially. And not just like being placed under this genjutsu nerfs all your stats, but we know that genjutsu is able to control all 5 of your senses. And we know that all 5 of your senses are incredibly crucial for ninja battle. You need to be able to see, smell, hear, feel what's going on around you. So what if outside of being able to brainwash somebody, Kagami Uchiha's Kodo Matsukame like genjutsu, also messed with your ability to use your ninjutsu, messed with your ability to battle, just messed with you to the point where not only has your entire personality been changed, but your ability has been changed. But if that's a bridge too far for you, we can pretty concretely say that a Kodo Matsukame like jutsu would stop Hanzo from training. It would weaken him. And that goes double if he stayed in this genjutsu for a little bit and then was broken out of it. Because we don't truly know whether or not you can be broken out of Kagami's genjutsu. But we do know the consequences of being broken out of a powerful genjutsu that you've been under for a while are dire. And while obviously being broken out of this genjutsu basically killed Yakura, he spent years under this genjutsu. Hanzo at most would spend a couple of months. And this point is somewhat backed up by the fact that when we see Hanzo's death, he's like,
"Oh, how'd you manage to make it past all of my power?"
As all 6 of the paths of pain encroach into his room. But all we see from Hanzo is that there's an alcohol bottle close by, there's some blood running down his forehead, and they're in a building. But Hanzo famously summons a massive salamander to help him battle. Why would Hanzo not summon the salamander? Why were they still inside? It seems as though Hanzo put up next to no fight. The only things that were broken were some paper screens in his room. But a battle between a man who was able to defeat all 3 of the legendary Sannin in the 6 paths of pain should have destroyed half of the Rain Village. Yet we did $25 in damage? But the most perplexing part about this is that Hanzo asks, "How are you able to make it past all of my power?" Implying that he did at the very least try to fight them. What's even more perplexing about this is that Hanzo is one of the only people to ever try to break Edo Tensei. See, when Hanzo was brought back in the 4th Great Shinobi World War, we're treated to a battle between him and Mifune, where we see that him and Mifune had battled in a previous life. Mifune during this battle reminds Hanzo of how he died, which Hanzo does remember, but it seems as though Hanzo does not remember large parts of his life, large parts where he lost his edge. But upon remembering Mifune and the battles that they had, Hanzo cuts open his poison sac by himself. Hanzo's convictions are so rock solid that when he remembers Mifune in the battle that they had had previously, he becomes one of the only Edo Tensei people ever to try and take himself out. See, well, obviously tons of Edo Tensei characters gave hints on how you can defeat them, like Gengetsu when he summoned his giant clam and was telling everybody how to defeat the clam. None of them could physically move against the controls of Kabuto. They all retained their own personalities and therefore they could give as many hints as possible. Hanzo purposely crippled himself by opening up his gas sack and pulling off his mask, giving Mifune the opening necessary to defeat him. In fact, Kabuto was blown away by this and had to take over his body. So how is a man whose convictions are so rock solid that he's able to override the rules of Edo Tensei without any Kodo Matsukame in the mix like Itachi, have his convictions swayed so seriously that he not only throws out all of his ideals, but his power over a couple of dead bodies, delivered by a man who led armies into his nation? And it could happen. Kagami Uchiha disappears. Danzo's wearing a bandage when he meets face to face with Hanzo, and Hanzo undergoes a massive ideological change. Sure, of course, it could just be that absolute power corrupts absolutely. But what if it was something cooler? But what do you guys think? Do you go with the theory or the narrative device? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. By the way, I'm aware that my office looks like I'm a single dad who lost all of his statues in the divorce me and my girlfriend are moving.